Good morning or afternoon, class. I wanted to continue on to the next section of ecology. The first one was on interactions between organisms. There's 5 different interactions. There's predation, parasitism, competition, mutualism, and commensalism. So those are the 5 different interactions. Hopefully you know the difference between those 5. I'm going to move forward into the notes into the next part. This unit is divided up into 6 parts. And the second part is energy, or the flow of energy through an ecosystem. And I am on slide 25. Yep, 25. If you open up another tab and go to the Google Classroom, go to classwork. On the left side, you'll find ecology, and then select that. Scroll down to the bottom, and you'll find the PowerPoint that I'm on. So, depending on what version you open this in, it may end up with little boxes on the slide where the notes are in red. Those boxes actually should be arrows pointing to the right. A new version or older version of Word or PowerPoint doesn't read that code correctly, so it changes the arrows into empty boxes. Sorry about that. That's what my computer is showing. But I know it's supposed to be arrows pointing to the right. So the very first slide is on food chains. You've been doing food chains since elementary school. You probably encountered it in middle school. Well, here it is again, just as a review, so hopefully you don't forget what they are. Food chain is the simplest path that energy can take through an ecosystem, from organism 1 to organism 2 to 3 and so on. The ultimate source of energy for Mother Earth, of course, comes from the sun, but that is not an organism. The sun is not an organism, so it shouldn't be considered the first part of a food chain. Instead, the first one is what absorbs the energy from the sun, or if it is a chemosynthesizer, then from the heat of the earth and the chemicals available to it, the compounds. But that's the exception to the rule. Most living things, the beginning of the food chain starts with a photosynthesizer, like our plants. So there is a T word that is in red, used a couple times, trophic. Trophic refers to food. So this is the food level. The first food level is our baseline. That's where our photosynthetic plants are. And they absorb the energy from the sun and convert it into carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and they also make nucleic acids. They can get eaten and consumed by the second trophic level, so whatever eats the plants. And then the third trophic level eats them, and then there's a fourth and a fifth. It continues for quite a while. The next slide, which is number 26, is a food chain, a very simple one. Our first level, our first trophic level, is the flower. It is what we call a primary producer. Primary meaning first producer of our carbs, our lipids, and our proteins. Then we have our primary consumer, our first to consume, which is the caterpillar. Very small in the picture, but it's there on the leaf. And then we have our secondary consumer, which is the frog that eats the caterpillar. Then we have our tertiary consumer, which is the snake that eats the frog. And then quaternary consumer, which is the owl that eats the snake. So each of these is a trophic level. The flower being the first, the caterpillar being the second, frog being the third, snake being the fourth, and then owl being the fifth. And probably the owl will get eaten by something else as well. So going through these trophic levels. The first trophic level is our primary producers, and they are primarily made up of autotrophs. So there's a word you may not know. Auto means self, like an automobile is something you can make yourself mobile by yourself. You control the mobile device by yourself, automobile. Since troph refers to food, autotroph means that it makes itself its own food. It's a food producer for itself. And this can be our plants, but there's also protists, like our algae, that can produce this. And then there is actually a few, very, very few photosynthetic animals. Like, for example, a salamander that lives off the coast of North Carolina that actually can do photosynthesis. It's an animal, exception to the rule, a weird one, that can do photosynthesis because it eats algae. However, there is an exception, and I'm on slide 28. There is some primary producers that don't use sunlight. They don't use photosynthesis. And those are chemosynthesizers. They may use heat and compounds found in the earth to do chemosynthesis to make their carbs, their lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And the next slide, which is 29, is just a picture of the two different categories. On the left is our photosynthesizers, on the right is our chemosynthesizers. Like at the bottom of the ocean where there's heat vents, that living things can live near those heat vents and use that heat and the materials that are excreted out of it to make their organic compounds. The second trophic level, and I'm on slide 30, is our primary consumers, our first to consume another living thing. And we call those also heterotrophs. Hetero means other, troph, food, so they cannot make their food. They have to get their food from another source, other food. These are very diverse. There's many different examples of heterotrophs. They can be our grasshoppers, our rabbits, or our zooplankton. If you're familiar with SpongeBob, SpongeBob has his nemesis, which is plankton, which is a zooplankton. He does not do photosynthesis. He eats other things, so he's zooplankton, an animal-like plankton. Of course, we could also call them herbivores. Herb is a soft tissue plant, and a herbivore eats soft tissue plants. The third trophic level, and I'm on slide 32, is our consumers. So third trophic level, fourth trophic level, fifth trophic level, sixth trophic level, keep on going. We can stop and just call them all consumers. Now, if the consumer eats primary consumers, we call those herbivores. If they eat secondary consumers, then we call those, of course, carnivores. So consumers that generally eat primary consumers are called carnivores. Sorry if I said that wrong earlier. Consumers that eat primary producers are herbivores. Consumers that eat primary consumers are carnivores. Like when you go to the Mexican restaurant, you order queso con carne. Queso is cheese, con with, carne, meat. So carne, meat. Carnivores eat meats. And then there's also omnivores. An omnivore eats both plant material and meat. So there actually is more omnivores than we like to consider. Like, for example, we're omnivores. You eat meat and vegetables and fruits. There's wolves that will eat grass and plant material when available, but prefer to make most of their diet off of meat. Frogs will eat algae and insects. Minnows will eat algae and also insects as well. The next slide, which is 33, is a term that most high schoolers do not know, and it's in red, detrivore. A detrivore eats detritus. Detritus is dead and decaying matter. So you may know a decomposer. Decomposers fall underneath this category of a detrivore. But a decomposer only breaks things down into the soil, like an earthworm as a decomposer, or a mushroom as a decomposer. But that leaves out things like crabs and vultures. A crab will move along the ocean side in the sand dunes and find dead, washed up fish and clams, and will eat those dead pieces of former living things. And it's not a decomposer, it's not creating soil, it is a detrivore. A vulture will find a dead raccoon or possum on the side of the road and eat that. And its goal is not to create soil. Its goal is to get a meal. And it's a detrivore. It doesn't fall underneath the category of a decomposer. Now, detrivores are really helpful because they help break down waste materials that can then either directly go into the soil, like a decomposer, or need some extra steps, like our crabs and our vultures, before they can become soil. but they're speeding up the process. They're helping return the nutrients either to the water, the land, or maybe the air. I'll attach a link to the video about dead stuff, which is on the slide with the cat and the human. And then the next slide, which I'm almost done with the flow of energy, is on 35, food web. So, a food chain is the simplest path that living things can get energy and pass it from one level to another, from one trophic level to the next. But it's not very realistic. That's not how nature really works. It looks great on paper, but for example, humans, we don't eat just one thing. We have a diverse diet. And a lot of organisms have very diverse diets. They eat a range of different materials. Of course, there's exceptions. You probably are aware of like the koala bear that only eats eucalyptus. The panda bear only really eats bamboo. But there is many more organisms that have a bigger buffet for their diet. So when we do a food chain, we're leaving out a lot of their food sources and it doesn't give us a complete picture. But a food web shows us much more information. So grabbing the whiteboard, just temporarily. Food chain, much more simplistic. A food web, more complex. I have the different trophic levels. So our first trophic level is our primary producers. That is my grass, my plant material. Then we have our second trophic level, which is our primary consumers. I use grasshoppers, but there's more than grasshoppers that eat grass. There's beetles and little animals. There's a lot of different things that will eat our plant material. Our third trophic level, which is, we could just call our consumers, that and everything above. For our food chain, grasshopper gets eaten by the birds, but grasshoppers can also get eaten by mice. They'll eat them as a delicacy. A food web shows much more, and this is even a simple food web. Food chain, just straightforward. So from bird to snake to black bear. But in here, there's much more room for movement. So food chain versus food web. I gave you two examples in the slides. I got one that is land-based. That's the one with the plants at the bottom and the fox and the hawk and the snake at the top. But then I also have an aquatic one that show you some aquatic life in the ocean and that food web. All right, so let me just finish out the last little bit of energy. So I showed you on the whiteboard a food web and food chain, but we can show the movement of energy of carbs, lipids, and proteins in different ways. And scientists, ecologists, have come up with a ecological pyramid is primarily a tool that they use to illustrate the flow of energy. So it is nothing more than a simple little pyramid where the base is going to be our primary producers, and then we work our way up to the very top of the pyramid, which is going to be our top consumer, our apex predator. The slide there has a lot of notes in blue. Hopefully you can pause this video and read that over. Every time that we move up a level, and I'm on the slide with the pyramid and the big bear at the top and the grass at the bottom, as we move from one level to next level to next level, we lose a lot of energy. For example, our plants, when they're growing, there's large portions of the plant that animals don't eat. They may not eat the roots, they may not eat the stems, they may just eat the leaves. So it leaves a lot of the plant behind. That's wasted energy when a herbivore, like a deer or a rabbit, comes and eats that plant. It's not getting the full amount of calories. Plus that plant used up a lot of energy, a lot of calories to make growth. So there was more input into that plant than the rabbit or the deer is going to get out. Same thing for the next level. If the deer was to live for many, many years, it's going to use up a lot of calories for growth and maintenance and just surviving before a predator like a wolf or a bear will get it. So when the wolf or bear gets the deer, then it's not getting every bit of the calorie or the energy that went into that deer. It's only getting roughly about 10% of what goes into the organism once it is consumed. So we estimate, this is a very rough estimate, that 90% of every time we move up a trophic level, we lose 90% of the energy that went in. That's why you may have seen in the news or on YouTube, there's a movement where people are trying to reduce the amount of beef that they consume because it takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of energy that goes into making a cow to turn it into beef. And it is less energy, less water to just go ahead and eat the salad. Why grow greens to feed to the cow and we lose about 90% of that energy that went into the greens that goes into the cow, and then we eat the cow and we lose 90% of the energy that went into the cow. That's not a very effective use of energy or nutrients. So the argument is just go ahead and eat the salad. This is, of course, an argument of vegans. You may disagree. Besides showing the energy flow, we could also show populations. So I'm on slide 39. We could use a pyramid to show populations. If I was to send you out in the woods and have you count the trees within a certain area, you could put that onto a piece of paper and then go back and count all the herbivores in that area and then put that on the piece of paper and then count all the carnivores in the woods in that area. And you'd see a pyramid forming where there's a lot more plants, less herbivores, and a very small number of carnivores. The numbers keep reducing every time you go up the trophic levels. And that's a number pyramid. There's also biomass pyramid. So biomass, living, mass is stuff that takes up space. So the living stuff that takes up space is a simple way of defining it. Biomass is the weight of a living thing. So we could, again, go back in the woods and we could weigh. We could weigh all the plant material, weigh all the herbivores and all the carnivores. Now, for weighing trees and shrubs that are planted in the dirt, that would have to be an estimate. And there is math equations to come up with a good estimate of the plants. But when we do that, we come up again with the pyramid shape, where most of the biomass is made of the trees and the shrubs and the grasses, and then there's less for our herbivores, and the least amount is our carnivores. They take up the least amount of weight. All right, that closes out energy, the energy part. The next section is going to be on population controls, which sounds worse than it really is. This is not probably what you're thinking of. So stay tuned for the next video.